Good evening, and welcome to the New York Society Library. I am Sarah Holliday, the library's head of events, and I am just here momentarily to welcome you to the library's 270th anniversary year and to say a word about tonight's presenter. As we begin, we acknowledge that the library stands on traditional lands of the Lenape people and other indigenous peoples to whom we pay respect. So yes, as we may have bragged a few thousand times, the New York Society Library was founded in the spring of 1754, making us 270 years old this spring, and the oldest cultural institution in New York City. If you're not yet familiar with the place, we have a large general circulating collection of books, electronic resources, a vibrant children's library, services just for writers, and much, much more. We also have a diversity of rare and special books and historical materials, and thanks to my colleague Barbara Beek, our special collections librarian, for pulling out just a couple of very relevant items for tonight. So do get a moment to take a look at those after the presentation if you haven't already. We also offer a full season of events with authors and other presenters, so do take a look at what's coming up. I also want to be clear that we are live streaming and recording tonight's event as well as taking photographs. If I could ask you to silence your phone or anything that might make an unwanted sound, that would be great. And we thank you. Our 270th anniversary exhibition, just outside these doors, is called A Belief in Books, and it looks at the library's early history in a time that held to both Enlightenment ideas of freedom and human rights and the notion that slavery was a normal part of human societies. We've been honored to work with Dr. Leslie M. Harris on the exhibition, and I encourage you to read her remarkable essay in its catalog, which is available here tonight at our book sales table or at the front desk anytime this year. Dr. Harris is a professor of history at Northwestern University, where her teaching and scholarship focus on complicating the ideas we all hold about the history of African Americans in the United States, and, especially relevant to this library, the prevailing view of slavery as a phenomenon of the South only. Her published works include the book In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863, which was awarded the Wesley Logan Prize by the American Historical Association, and the substantial book connected to the New York Historical Society's landmark 2005 exhibition, Slavery in New York, co-edited with Ira Berlin. She has also led and participated in a number of public history initiatives using history and dialogue to address challenges around racial and other forms of human diversity in higher education. We're glad to have Dr. Harris with us tonight to elaborate on the stellar work she's done related to the library's history and its overlap with the history of readers and of African American readers in New York City. We also gratefully acknowledge the support of Deirdre Kessler for tonight's event in honor of Harriet Shapiro. Please join me in welcoming to the lectern Dr. Leslie M. Harris.
Thank you for welcoming me. Special thanks to Ms. Kessler for her support tonight. I want to begin actually by telling you how I came to write this essay. It's kind of a funny story about how I came to write an essay about the New York Society Library in honor of this amazing 270th anniversary. In spring of 2023, I was in a cab going from the east side to the west side, right along 79th Street, and I looked out the window, and for the first time I saw this building. I had never heard of the library, and the person I was with knew a little bit about it and was friends with a member of two, but she couldn't tell me much else about it. She lives in the East Village, a few miles and a world away. Just a few months later, I received a phone call from Harriet Shapiro, someone very dear to those of you gathered here. She was full of excitement to be speaking with me. She had begun reading my first book, In the Shadow of Slavery, about African Americans in New York City in the pre-Civil War era. She explained that the library was coming on this momentous anniversary, and she was trying to figure out the role of slavery and of African Americans in the institution. I said that I could certainly speak with her about what I knew of enslaved labor around the time of the library's founding, and I think I was expecting that I was going to read some labels for an exhibition and have a few more conversations. So we spoke a couple of times by phone. I was in Chicago, and actually I was in a sister library, if you will, at the Newberry Library at that time. And then in our third phone call, Harriet began to talk about writing an essay. So as you research the essay, I said to her, you might look for these kinds of records in your archives. Oh no, she replied, I would like you to write the essay. Those of you who know Harriet know that she was passionate about the library, its history, and about books and authors, and she turned the full force of that on me. Before I knew it, I had agreed to write an essay of about 1,500 words, which those of you who've read it is a little longer than that, and to speak with the library audience today about it. So when I hung up the phone, I have no idea what had happened to me, but here we are. I'm really sorry to say that I did not get to meet Harriet in person. I had made a plan to visit the archives at the end of the summer, and in July I received the terrible news that she had passed away after a brief illness. But I treasure that now too brief phone call I shared with her, and I envy those of you who knew her longer and who were inspired by her energy, intellect, and curiosity, all of which inspired me as well to delve, if so very briefly, into this library and its history. I'd also like to take this time to thank Barbara Beek and Sarah Holliday, who became my guides to the library, its history, and its archives. None of us really knew by the time I came here what to think of my task, as Harriet herself had only begun to think about how we could research this work in the library's archives. But they both shared with me all they knew, welcomed me to the library for a very intense week with many 18th and 19th century manuscript sources, and offered to answer all the additional questions I could come up with when I returned to Chicago to actually try to piece together what I found. Now, I'm going to take an additional minute to do something writers usually don't do, and that's going to thank the scholars who are in my footnotes. Because without their work, I could not have begun to write this essay, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. This essay and this talk literally would not exist without the important, well-researched work on the library's history by scholars named Sean Moore, Henry Cooper and Jenny Lawrence, Austin Keep from way back in the early 20th century, Tom Glynn, and Robert K. Wallace. As in so many things, I am deeply indebted to Shane White, whose book is right here on the table, The Extraordinary Historian of African Americans in New York. His book, Prince of Darkness, is a biography of the first known African American member of the library, Jeremiah Hamilton, and Shane's details of Hamilton's life and use of the library are fascinating. And this book, I started reading it on a plane, I couldn't put it down. He's an amazing writer. I strongly encourage it, not only for the work about the library, but just about the life of this person who Shane calls the first Black Wall Street millionaire. I'd also like to mention the work of Elizabeth McHenry, who's a professor at New York University, and whose first book, Forgotten Readers, is still the standard work on literary societies established by African Americans in the antebellum period, both in New York but in other cities as well. These are important organizations at the time when all libraries were private, and particularly when the vast majority of African Americans were kept out of these libraries, and when Black communities did not have the financial capital to establish the kind of library that the New York Society Library became. Finally, in addition to Shane's work on Blacks in New York, I'd like to mention two other scholars, Nicole Saffold Maskill's work and David Gelman's works on New York's enslaver class, the people who owned enslaved people or participated in the international slave trade from the 17th through the 19th century, who helped me to place some of the library's founders in their historical context. Now, why am I reading my footnotes to you? I want you to understand that as much as I learned about the New York Society Library during my visit to the archives at the end of last summer, and in reading the very valuable secondary source materials that outline its broad history, I was for a time really stumped about how to go about this project of incorporating African Americans into it. This is because the minutes and published records of the library say almost nothing about African Americans in this early time period. They don't say anything about New York's system of slavery, or the end of slavery in New York over the course of nearly 30 years of gradual emancipation. They say nothing of the numerous race riots, or frankly any other riots, in the pre-Civil War era. There is no mention of the Civil War, except for a brief note in one of the published annual reports that noticed something to the effect that the national disruptions had fortunately not disturbed the finances of the library. And in fact, they were doing kind of well in the early years of the Civil War. And let me tell you, after you read all the decades when they weren't doing well, you breathe a sigh of relief, even though you're kind of like, is that all you have to say? So the vast majority of the library's records worry dutifully and constantly about the finances of the library, the membership or the lack thereof. because they wanted more members, because of course members pay fees and dues of various sorts, and then of course the purchase of books and periodical subscriptions. When you're reading these things, you're turning these pages, it's all about the money. And the thousands of books, newspapers, and magazines that were part of the library's holdings during the time period I examined. Subsequent early accounts of the library's history, like the wonderful Austin Keep, who helped me figure out who these people were, those followed pretty closely to this method, focusing on the ways in which founding and ongoing members, officers, and trustees of the library came to support it, the library's relationships to the Anglican Church, and then its move into a more secular path. The library membership and leadership in these early works was discussed only insofar as these individuals interacted with what people thought were the only purposes of the library at the time. After a week of reading through minute books from the 1800s forward, I could have told you all too much about the fraught finances of the library, its numerous real estate transactions. Indeed, the drama of the financial narrative was really gripping, shockingly gripping. Knowing almost nothing of the library at the time I began, it was like reading a thriller or mystery. I didn't know what was going to happen. Halfway through my visit, I got to the part where a new library building was about to burn and there was a huge fire, and I practically had an attack of the vapors myself and went home very dejected, hoping that things would be better when I came back to the records the next day. In my conversations with Harriet, we had discussed whether perhaps enslaved people might have worked as laborers. Perhaps they loaded and unloaded barrels of books from Europe and took them through New York City streets to the library. In fact, quote-unquote cartmen had been excluded, white cartmen had excluded black laborers from their guild, the kind of people who would take things through the streets. So it's unlikely this happened. But for a moment in our conversations and afterwards, I allowed myself to imagine black laborers becoming curious about these books and the library in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and being inspired by the library to pursue literacy. In addition, after slavery ended, and as far as I can tell, those who worked in the library, even as manual laborers, say janitorial staff, were not black. So I had to let go of that idea. The New York Society Library gradually emerged for me as an institute always adjacent, even physically, to controversies and contestation about slavery, emancipation, and the role of black people as citizens. It was founded during the era of the international slave trade, and the library's founders were among the wealthiest slave traders in New York City. Its first cache of books came from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which was known in New York City, in particular, as an organization that taught enslaved people of African descent to read so that they might be converted to Christianity. In the mid-19th century, at the height of the controversies over slavery leading up to the Civil War, the library shared a city block with the Broadway Tabernacle, the site of annual conventions by the American Anti-Slavery Society, conventions that inspired violence by New York's pro-slavery activists. And of course, the library survived the New York City draft riots of 1863. Through all of these histories, however, the library managed to hover largely above these controversies, even as it directly benefited from some of them, for example, the slave trade. The library's history in New York City and its history of collecting in the 19th century compels me to ask, what does it mean to be an institution that appears at first glance resolutely neutral on some of the most compelling and controversial issues of our day? At second glance, I had to ask, is this truly neutrality? Perhaps my question should be, what does it mean to remain silent as an institution as the world around you shifts and changes? To begin to answer these interrelated questions for the library, let me give you a little more of a flavor of the library's history through the lens of slavery and race. When the New York Society Library was founded in 1754 as a quote-unquote public library, and of course many of you know public at that time means open to the public but not supported by government funds, so people would buy memberships or be in some other way pay money to use the library. So it had 700 quote new well-chosen volumes. When it opened at that time, the enslavement of people of African descent was firmly established as a central path to prosperity in the Americas, and New York City was no exception. As Sean Moore has detailed, among others, the founders, trustees, and members in the library's first century of existence came largely from elite families whose wealth was rooted in the African slave trade, the use of enslaved labor on their properties in New York City, the Hudson Valley, and beyond, or in the quote-unquote West India trade, as merchants supplying goods to Caribbean islands so focused on the slaves producing sugar that they did not create their own wheat, dairy, clothing, or other items. Like the city and the nation, the New York Society Library and its members would experience a slow movement away from the enslavement of people of African descent as a necessary part of the economic, social, and political life of the city and its own existence from the late 18th century through the late 19th century. A revolution as profound as the one that led to the creation of the United States. Although the library's subsequent histories would laud its role in the founding of the United States, the library never claimed a substantial role in the end of slavery in New York between 1799 and 1827, or the national end to slavery and the expansion of citizenship and suffrage after the Civil War. Its holdings and its membership largely reflected a middle path in a time filled with upheaval and controversy about the position of slavery and African Americans in the future of the city and the nation. The library's founding occurred at the height of the African slave trade to the Americas, when the largest number of enslaved people were imported to this side of the world and when the most money was made. And many, if not most, of the library's founders, founding and subsequent trustees, and members gained their initial wealth through the economic momentum that slavery provided. To give you just one example, founders Philip and Robert Livingston were part of a family company that held hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland in New York's Hudson Valley and the Catskills. And they used enslaved and European tenant labor to produce flour, iron, and barrels to transport Madeira wine and other goods, which were then traded to the Caribbean islands, where enslaved people produced sugar, and then to other global markets. For the Livingstons and their ilk, the enslaved labor they managed so well made the Americas more productive than the Native Americans they displaced. Their landed wealth enabled them to imagine recreating the intellectual world they left behind in Europe, albeit slowly and haltingly, given the relative lack of books and writers in the quote-unquote New World. Now, I've already mentioned that the library's first cache of books was donated to them by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. But that inheritance from the society, which had publicly called for the education of enslaved African Americans, did not lead the library to call for the education of all New Yorkers, inclusive of blacks and Native Americans. Indeed, the SPG had been blamed briefly for encouraging enslaved people to rise up in rebellion earlier in the 18th century, although this was very unlikely. In addition, very few enslavers allowed their enslaved people to attend these classes, although there was no law at the time outlawing literacy among enslaved people. It was not illegal to teach enslaved people to read. If many founders of the New York Society Library were enslavers, some of those enslavers began to turn to anti-slavery activism in the decades after the Revolutionary War. A few trustees and slaveholders were part of the New York Manumission Society, which agitated for gradual emancipation, established the African free schools, and provided legal assistance to blacks held illegally as slaves or kidnapped or sold south. John Murray, John Jay, and Jay's sons Peter, Augustus, and William are among the most well-known of these early anti-slavery activists who were also members of the New York Society Library. As Shane White has argued, their commitment to ending slavery was fairly conservative. John Jay did not free his own slaves, although Quakers such as Murray did as part of the strictures of his denomination by the late 18th century. And their children and grandchildren divided a little bit in terms of their embrace or not of radical abolition by the 1830s and beyond. Peter Augustus Jay and William Jay both became jurists and staunch supporters of radical abolition and of equal rights for free blacks. And I should say that radical abolitionists believed that the twin goal of their movement by the 1830s was the immediate end to slavery and racial equality. So I've separated them out, but those are really, for them, bound together. And many people, only a few people at the very beginning, thought that that should be the case. When the New York State Legislature debated extending universal suffrage to black men, Peter Jay argued strongly that they should receive it, and this would be in the 1820s. And William Jay argued against the American Colonization Society, whose big idea about ending slavery was that that enslaved blacks should only become free if they were then repatriated to Liberia in West Africa. Of course, they were not all from Liberia. By the 1830s, both Peter and William Jay had aligned themselves with the radical abolitionists who argued that slavery in the South should end immediately and free blacks everywhere should have equal rights. From the 1830s until his death, William Jay served as a lawyer to New York's blacks who had been accused of being fugitives from Southern slavery. And so defending them in court and saying they deserve to stay in New York. Many people were kidnapped erroneously. If you think about Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave, that was actually something that was fairly common on the streets of New York and elsewhere. Now, John Murray, the Quaker John Murray, his great-granddaughter Mary Murray would take a less radical but no less impactful path. In the mid-1830s, she and her aunt, Anna Shotwell, founded the Association for the Benefit of Colored Orphans. And if you saw my book out front, the front picture is from that orphanage. Neither the organization nor its female founders and trustees ever fully aligned publicly with the radical abolitionists. Indeed, they even accepted a group of children sent from Cuba to the orphanage, sent by an enslaver there. The children may have been his. He may have placed them in the orphanage to advance their education. This is unremarked upon in the records. They don't make any comment about whether or not these children are enslaved or free. But the orphanage's care for black children was visible enough and disturbing enough that it was burned to the ground by anti-black equality mobs during the 1863 New York City draft riots. Now, one more link to radical abolition, a brief link. In the 1830s, Arthur Tappan, one of the leading radical anti-slavery activists in New York and the nation, was briefly affiliated with the library. The library was one of several institutions struggling to build an audience that would distinguish it among New Yorkers and yield, of course, consistent financial support. Another was the Athenaeum, library in Latin, which struggled even more than the Society Library did. The Society Library and the Athenaeum shared some leaders in common, and when the library began planning a move from its location on Nassau Street, the trustees who also belonged to the Athenaeum said, why don't we bring these two institutions together and have them share space? One of the Athenaeum supporters who was involved in these conversations was Arthur Tappan, who with his brother Lewis inaugurated among New York City's white anti-slavery community the idea of immediately ending slavery and equally prioritizing racial equality, as called for by the American Anti-Slavery Society's inaugural convention in 1833. The Society Library and the Athenaeum briefly owned a lot of land together on Broadway and Leonard Streets, where they planned to build a large shared facility with bookshelf-lined reading rooms that would hold both the institution's growing collections and to have public space for speeches and other public events, which was a particular strength of the Athenaeum that the Society hadn't really taken up. But ultimately, the Athenaeum was unable to sustain its financial part of the bargain, and so it gave all its books and its membership rolls to the library, and the library alone built a very large and substantial building on that plot of land. Now, for a few years, Arthur Tappan remained on the Society Library's membership rolls, but he never took a leadership position. And I think that most of his energy, and apparently his philanthropic dollars, went towards fighting Southern slavery and Northern anti-black racism via the various anti-slavery societies of the time. The Society Library's new building on Broadway placed it on the same block as one of the hotbeds of radical abolitionism, the Broadway Tabernacle. The Tabernacle was initially home to Second Presbyterian Church, which was an anti-slavery congregation organized in 1832 by Lewis Tappan and Charles Grandison Finney. And both of these figures, the Tappans and Finney, they all came to anti-slavery activism via their fiery evangelical Christian religious beliefs. The church moved to the Tabernacle, the newly built Tabernacle, in 1836, but Finney remained there less than a year before moving to Oberlin College. The Tabernacle did host a variety of speakers. It was not only an anti-slavery institution, but it was most well known in the city as a flashpoint for conflicts between anti-slavery activists and violent pro-slavery and anti-black protesters. And just a reminder that this radical anti-slavery movement was also a pacifist movement. It's one of the first sort of major pacifist movements in our country. Their activism was speaking, moral suasion. Those who were against them had no problem beating them up in the streets, and that's literal. The American Anti-Slavery Society often held its annual conventions at the Broadway Tabernacle with speakers such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, among others. These events were often subject to mobs who interrupted them, jeered the speakers, and sometimes devolved into rock throwing and physical violence. There are all these accounts of mobs, dragging anti-slavery speakers out into the streets. In Philadelphia, a meeting house was burned. I mean, these were serious throughout the Northeast. There was serious violence against anti-slavery activists and events and businesses. One might ask, how did being neighbors lead members of the Society Library to greater radicalism, either pro-slavery or anti-slavery? If we look at the library's subscriptions, they include northern and southern newspapers, and they, again, seem to be skewing towards those relevant for kind of mainstream political and economic coverage in the US and internationally. So some titles, for example, the New York Herald, New Orleans' Picayune, and Baltimore's Niles Weekly Register. Now, I would say, as an historian of slavery and from the South, that if you're subscribing to Southern newspapers at this time, these are going to be pro-slavery newspapers. But maybe they didn't think that way. You know, these are also going to be major newspapers. If you are involved in economics at any point, New Orleans is on your radar. It's more than on your radar. If New York is one pole of our economy at that time, New Orleans is the other one. And so to be part of that economic world, you have to know what's going on. And Baltimore is not far behind. In terms of literary magazines, the library subscribed to Southern, Northern, and international journals that, again, were no doubt considered mainstream at the time. A different kind of newspaper was one founded by the Tappan brothers and Samuel F.B. Morse, some of you may have heard of, the Journal of Commerce. Initially, the Tappans thought of the paper as one that would take a stance on the moral issues of the day. And when they founded it in the 1820s, they were more thinking about temperance and anti-prostitution, those kinds of things. They hadn't quite yet gotten into anti-slavery. But the journal quickly became a leading paper on national and international commercial activities more broadly, due to both the Tappans and Morse's strong interest in commerce. And remember that the Tappan brothers inaugurated the credit reporting service that would become Dun & Bradstreet. So, okay. When David Hale took over the paper from the Tappans in the 1840s, the paper in fact became more critical of radical anti-slavery activists, and that could be because of the split within the radical abolitionist movement. I won't go into it now, but very exciting. Anyway, but much more importantly for the Journal of Commerce's success and relevance was that it was one of the first newspapers to make use of Morse's telegraph to receive news from across the country and abroad. So the commercial side of its reporting outweighed its views on other issues of the day, and thus it was subscribed to by the library. Despite the library's early connection to Arthur Tappan, it did not subscribe, for example, to the Emancipator, the newspaper founded by the Tappans to go into anti-slavery, nor did it subscribe to other anti-slavery newspapers. In fact, the scholar Sean Moore, in examining the library's book catalog in the late 18th century at the inauguration of the first anti-slavery movements nationally and internationally, notes that the library at that time did purchase a number of works that could be considered anti-slavery, including Olaudah Equianu's narrative, which detailed his experiences in the Middle Passage, his journeys throughout the British Caribbean, England, and the US as an enslaved person and then gaining his freedom, and he wrote it as an appeal to the British Parliament to end slavery. There are also a volume or two of the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley. But Moore argues that if you look at the circulation records, the works that supported slavery were more popular than those that argued against it in terms of the members. When I tried to follow his methodology for later years through my examination, which may be imperfect, there are only a few more books dealing with anti-slavery themes in the library. There's a work acquired by the Abbé Grégoire, the French anti-slavery writer, in 1825. And then there's a group of books that I'm not sure how to characterize. I probably have to read them to know more about them, but a range of books describing non-European locations, travel accounts of Africa, India, and beyond. And here I'm thinking about a scholar, I'm blanking on her name, but who wrote a book called Thomas Jefferson's Quran, and thinking about what it would mean for Thomas. She writes about what it meant for Thomas Jefferson to own a Quran, so what does it mean for this collection to have these kinds of books, even if there's an imperfect. They're not us today, but you know, they are collecting things that they think are important for an educated person to know. At the same time, however, no books written by radical US abolitionists about Southern slavery appear on the list, and no anti-slavery newspapers. I will note, interestingly or not, that Lydia Maria Child's Letters from New York, which was published in 1843, a compilation of columns she wrote while editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, were acquired by the library. And those letters do talk about race relations in New York, black people in New York. So I haven't read them in a long time, so it'd be interesting for me. I didn't have time, but to go back and read them now and think about, is it just the title, Letters from New York, was enough for them to overlook the more radical aspects of that volume? Books by fugitive slaves or by free blacks were also absent, so you might imagine Frederick Douglass's narrative? No. And despite the fact that the first black newspaper, Freedom's Journal, was founded in New York City, there's no evidence that it or its New York successors, the Colored American, for example, or the Anglo-African, were subscribed to by the library, nor were any of Frederick Douglass's newspapers subscribed to. I'd like to put the fact that the New York Society Library did not feel that it had to address these issues or represent black periodicals in its collections as somewhat typical even today of how the segregation of knowledge can work through institutions. At the same time that the New York Society Library was delimiting its collection to include only quote-unquote mainstream ideas, people of African descent were establishing reading rooms, literary societies, and even small, if ephemeral, libraries that both included their own publications, the publications of their anti-slavery allies, and the writings that the white mainstream believed necessary to be an educated person and citizen at the time. They did so for a variety of reasons. Of course, black people needed to know the arguments and contours of the leadership class, the vast majority of whom were resolutely dedicated to their oppression at the bottom of the economic hierarchy and their exclusion from politics. Black people did not have the vote, just as one example, at the same rate as white people did. Black newspapers and other writings were deeply engaged with the ideas of their time and also with arguing against the defects and limits of those ideas. But black people who came to libraries, reading rooms, and literary societies also attended these events out of a genuine intellectual interest. For most of the 19th and into the 20th century, black people had the highest literacy rates among working class people. And the majority of black people, I probably don't have to tell you, were working class and poor. During the Emancipation era in New York City and after emancipation in the South, black people of all ages attended churches, informal and formal schools in order to learn how to read. They saw it as a path to freedom and power, even as local governments consistently underfunded the institutions dedicated to serve them. I'm currently reading a fascinating new manuscript by Sarah Groningsatter, who's here tonight. She's right back there. Just as a quick example from her new book, which will be out this summer, she starts one of her chapters with two young people who were indentured to their mothers enslavers as part of gradual emancipation, and they're about 18 years old. These two young people go to court because their owners are supposed to give them access to education, and they haven't. Having violated the terms of that agreement, because the owners violated the terms of that agreement, both young people are granted their freedom. And I have no doubt that they began attending school in order to get the education they were deprived of. So it just gives you a sense. If you can imagine 18-year-olds today doing that, it's a different time, it's a different time, it's a different time. The New York Society Library did not seek out black members, and perhaps its fees would have been too high for the economically fragile black community to take full advantage of it. But it's more disappointing to me that it did not subscribe to a wider range of newspapers and writings that were at the center of the politics of the day. Now, that's the kind of bad news. The New York Society Library did get a little bit of influence from the American Anti-Slavery Society. At least a few radical abolitionists spoke there in the 1840s and 50s, and in 1850, the library allowed the American Anti-Slavery Society to meet in its rooms during its May 1850 convention. And again, it had these rooms for rent. That was part of its income, but of course, it could have said no at that time, and it did not. This is an area, I think, for further research because in newspapers of the time, because not everyone who spoke in the Society's building is listed in the records I looked at. And I'll give you just one important example. The Elevator, a black newspaper based in San Francisco, of all places, recalled, and this article is, I think, from the 1860s, but it recalled that in 1843, the library hosted a debate between James McCune Smith and a Professor Grant on, quote, the anatomical comparison of the white man and the Negro, arguing about the identity of the latter with the orangutan, very typical of the racism of this time. Now, McCune Smith was a graduate of the New York African Free Schools, who then traveled to the University of Glasgow to complete a medical degree, as the medical schools at Columbia and Geneva College would not accept him on account of his race. He became the first black doctor in the US. Upon his return to New York City in 1839, he opened a pharmacy, medical practice, and evening school. And also, I should say, in the back of his pharmacy, I just learned this week, he had a little library where people gathered to read and borrow books. He also lectured and wrote extensively on scientific racism until his death in 1865. According to the newspaper article, quote, the discussion between McCune Smith and Grant was held in the lecture room of the New York Society Library and was continued for 3 nights. Captain Isaiah Reinders was present, and this is, he'll come back in a little while, and he swore that the quote unquote N-word had the best of the argument, for whatever that's worth. The New York Society Library's decision to allow anti-slavery speakers and debates about race in its building was no small commitment. From the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, anti-black mobs had disrupted meetings of the organization in New York, Philadelphia, and other cities and locales across the North. And one of the most violent riots of the antebellum period occurred in New York City in 1834, when over 3 days, anti-black, anti-amalgamation, and anti-abolition mobs rioted, damaging and destroying sites associated with radical anti-slavery, including the homes of the Tappan brothers, businesses and homes of black people, and church buildings of congregations associated with radical abolition. In 1850, Frederick Douglass's appearance at the New York Society Library as part of the American Anti-Slavery Society's annual meeting also invited physical confrontation. He was in his first decade of fame and infamy as a fugitive from Southern slavery, a celebrated author, an anti-slavery lecturer, a newspaper editor, and a black man who dared to socialize, politic, and share leadership with whites and criticize white racism and the shortcomings of the United States. Historian Robert Wallace argues that Douglass's fiery speeches at the Broadway Tabernacle over the course of the 1840s were an integral part of the ferment that led to the Astor Place riots of 1849, in which natives, led by a friend, Captain Isaiah Reinders, disrupted the British actor William Macready's performance of Macbeth. The working-class white rioters were taking the side of American actor Edwin Forrest in a feud between the two, but they were also protesting the elitism of British culture over American culture, and in their view, the long-term favoritism of a new class of elite whites who favored racial equality, the end of slavery, and black-white amalgamation, defined as interracial socializing and marriage. These were the charges that had been central to the 1834 riots and were now merged with the charges of the nativist riots in 1849. The very next year, in 1850, Douglass spoke at the New York Society Library as part of the American Anti-Slavery Society's convention. As Walker states, Douglass and 2 Englishwomen had been physically attacked for walking together in public just a few days before this speech, and Reinders and a group of rioters had disrupted anti-slavery meetings at Shiloh Presbyterian Church, a black congregation, and at the New York Society Library. When Douglass rose to speak on May 7th at the library, Reinders and a mob were there to confront him. New York newspapers had accused Douglass of treason in the days leading up to his speech. When Douglass appeared on the stage that morning, Reinders and the rioters were, quote, within a yard of the speaker, constantly interrupting him. Douglass made it through his speech, responding to the constant abuse throughout, and did so without physical harm to himself. But the mob did manage to prevent the meeting scheduled for the library that afternoon and the next morning, despite the presence of police, and thus ended the convention, stopped the convention from proceeding. It's perhaps not surprising that no New York City venue would allow the American Anti-Slavery Society to meet there in 1851, and the annual convention that year was held in Syracuse instead. Public proclamations of anti-slavery and anti-racist ideas would become increasingly dangerous in New York City and the northern states in the following 2 decades. Free blacks in the North would be in danger of re-enslavement due to the provisions of the federal fugitive slave law passed in 1850, which clarified, that any black person found to be a fugitive was to be returned to their enslaver regardless of the legality of slavery in the northern states. In New York City, the conflict among New Yorkers about the economic and political disruptions that the Civil War engendered, as well as anti-black animus, would lead eventually to the bloody draft riots of 1863, believed to be the worst riots in terms of loss of life and property in the city's entire history. Throughout these difficult times, not only did whites fear the loss of the benefits of Southern slave labor, they also feared that black people would be raised to an equal standing with whites, which they equated with the loss of economic and political power. In this difficult context, one more quiet action by the New York Society Library stands out: the acceptance of our friend Jeremiah G. Hamilton as a shareholder and member. Hamilton's biographer, Shane White, has identified him as Wall Street's first black millionaire. No doubt the library was always in search of wealthy members, shareholders, patrons who might assist it in shoring up its finances. But few white organizations would have accepted a black member on a basis of equality in these troubled times without something larger than financial possibility in mind. Hamilton's life story, as recovered by White, did not immediately begin with an indication that he would end up in one of the most exclusive libraries in New York City, and not simply because of his race. Hamilton began his adult life as a con man, taking counterfeit funds to Haiti in the early years of the island's independence from France. There, he narrowly escaped capture and execution by the Haitian government. He then cut an impressive, if ruthless, path through New York's moneyed classes, including even Sanborn Wentworth Butler, a librarian at the New York Society Library. Litigating, cheating, and skinning his way to a status as a legitimate investor would ultimately allow him to build a house described approvingly as tasteful in white newspapers and magazines. It would allow him to hobnob with middle-class and elite whites, and upon his death in 1875, to have numerous obituaries written of him and his successes in New York's newspapers. He was not part of anti-slavery activities, and although Frederick Douglass, James McCune Smith, and no doubt many other black people in New York and beyond knew him, he does not seem to have had any close political or social ties to African American institutions or people. His closest friend, according to White, was Benjamin Day, the white man who was the founder of the New York Sun newspaper. Now, we don't know if Hamilton actually sat in the reading rooms of the library, elbow to elbow with other patrons who were almost certainly all white. The cost of library membership alone would have been prohibitive for the vast majority of New York's African Americans. And as I've already said, black efforts to build their own libraries and reading rooms were episodic at best in the antebellum period, and often begun by anti-slavery activists. Hamilton purchased his share in the library in 1856, a time that would have been challenging in terms of interracial mixture. Streetcars and restaurants remained segregated, and the attempt by black men and women to use streetcars designated for whites led to physical removal and sometimes beatings by police and by other whites, and by whites on the streetcars. Elite members of society might not resort to physical violence, but the library could ill afford to lose any members who might themselves leave quietly and firmly. Hamilton's own use of the library reflects his apparent lack of interest in black political activism. As White details, Hamilton used the library heavily during his membership, although more so in the last 5 years of his life. He checked out in total in excess of 250 books. The vast majority of the records of his use show that he used it from the 1870s, perhaps indicating that the post-Civil War period was an easier time for a black man to use the library, but also indicating that he was working less in the final 5 years of his life and thus had more time to read. His reading lists range from British works that inspired the American Revolutionary, such as Hobbes and Bolingbroke, to classics by Plato, Cicero, Tacitus, and others. He read Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, histories written by British writers, and fictional works by authors from Goethe to Boccaccio, Dante, Fielding, Dickens, and Thackeray. White states that only a very few of the books Hamilton read dealt with any U.S. history. Most interestingly to me, he checked out several books on what we would today call interior design. White wonders if this occurred as he and his wife were considering the purchase of a new home, which would later be described as, quote, a model of comfort and elegance. Jeremiah Hamilton was apparently an anomaly in the library's pre-Civil War history. Did the Civil War and emancipation change the library's practices? That continues to be a question of inquiry. But I will close by highlighting one member who might indicate the kinds of changes that the library's white leadership may have been undergoing in this time of movement from slavery to emancipation, if not to full embrace of racial equality. George Templeton Strong was part of the second generation in his family to hold a membership in the library. When he was 15, his father took him to the library to take out his own membership, and he remained a frequent user of the reading room, commenting in his extensive diaries on his time spent perusing the library's periodicals in the afternoons before returning home for dinner or joining a friend at a favorite restaurant to discuss the events of the day. A four-volume version of his voluminous diaries, edited by Alan Nevins and Milton Halsey Thomas and published in 1952, demonstrates the kind of crass racial conversations that someone like Strong might have had in the antebellum years, as well as the changes perhaps wrought by the draft riots specifically and the Civil War years more generally. In an 1860 diary entry, Strong complained of the political unrest inspired by the problems of slavery, which had led to the House of Representatives not yet organized, no speaker elected, and government at deadlock. I think I was here when it was very weird to read that. Does it sound a little familiar? Strong blamed this disorganization on politicians, quote, spending their time between ballotings and speech-making about John Brown, fugitive slaves, Hinton Rowan helpers, the impending crisis, and the irrepressible N-word generally. For Strong, quote, that black but comely biped is becoming a bore to me. No doubt he is a man and a brother, but his monopoly of attention is detrimental to the rest of the family. Despite the decades of black political activism against slavery and for racial equality in New York City, Strong doubted that he, the black man, cares much about having his wrongs redressed or his rights asserted. Black publications, Frederick Douglass, tens of other black people who had spoken and written nationally and internationally about slavery, black rights, and racial equality, and yet his sense of black activism and black citizenship was very narrow. A few short years later, however, in the aftermath of the New York City draft riots, Strong was among those elite New Yorkers who had to rethink the citizenship of the city and of the nation. The Union League Club, of which he was a founding member, was compelled by the horror of the draft riots to extend repair not only to the whites of New York City, but also to the hundreds of black people who had been physically harmed, turned out of their homes, and lost their belongings to the days of anti-black rioting. In March 1864, the 1st New York Regiment of Black troops assembled on Union Square in front of the Union League Clubhouse, a symbol that the nation had finally allowed black people to commit to the war they saw as being fought on their own behalf, and a symbol that the nation had realized that it was not simply a war to reunite the nation despite slavery, but a war to end slavery and recreate the nation anew. Strong wrote of this moment, quote, made my way with difficulty through the dense crowd that filled Union Square, for the 1st New York Negro Regiment, which is the 20th U.S. Colored Troops, was receiving its colors at the Union League Clubhouse. It has been organized by aid of subscriptions got up in this club. Our labors of a year ago, meaning after the draft riots, have borne fruit. The Union League has done something for the country. I saw this regiment march down Broadway after a spirited allocution by Charles King. The regiment was, quote, black but comely, and marched well. This march will be the subject of cords of historical paintings before 1900. It is among the most solemn memories of my life thus far. It would take more radical engagement and commitment than most members of the New York Society Library held in the pre-Civil War years to completely transform the patterns of racism and elitism that surrounded the library in the 19th century. The library seems to have defined itself as a fairly conservative institution in its goals, and its struggles with financial issues probably prevented it from having the ability to take more political risk institutionally, even if some of its leaders may have desired to do so. As a result, most of its members' political activism of any stripe occurred outside the walls of the library, even as the library committed to stocking an ultimately narrow representation of the literature that was being produced in the turbulent 19th century. But the New York Society Library's history also demonstrates the commitment of some more radical members and patrons who kept asking the question of what the library could be and who it could support. The answers to those questions remain with us today, both in terms of the library's history and its current mission. Today, many of our public libraries, schools, and institutions of higher education find ourselves asking, what is our role, and I think of this as a member of higher education, what is our role as institutions about the pressing political issues of the day? From the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement against police brutality, to an increasing drumbeat of censorship of books in public and school libraries across the nation, to current debates about the war in Israel-Palestine. institutions are struggling to figure out what is, quote, the right thing to do in terms of free speech, political speech, and education. Looking back at the New York Society Library's records, manuscript and published, reveals one path many, if not most, institutions take, the middle path, in an attempt to avoid the slings and arrows of opprobrium, no's to the account book, and the membership rolls. The New York Society Library seems to have avoided controversial books and newspapers, favoring those which no one could object to or toss in anger to the floor as they challenged their way of thinking. I would love to know what the discussions were when Jeremiah Hamilton appeared at the door to browse or stood at a desk to request his books. But even his presence in the library did not hint at the enormity of the change that was on the horizon. His lack of engagement with these issues allowed a few additional years of somnolence until the fires of the draft riots burned a new path into the city. What will be our fire next time, to quote James Baldwin? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was outstanding and fascinating. Do you feel good with taking
Absolutely.
audience
Of
questions?
course.
Somebody got any questions?
Yes.
Thanks very much. First question, with James Hamilton, the Black trustee of the Metropolitan Museum, there was a financier in 1870 who also was the subject of a book, but I read it so many years ago, I can't remember if it's the same person.
Maybe it's Jeremiah Hamilton, so maybe it could be. I mean, he's still alive in 1870. So
Yeah.
thanks for adding on.
Right.
So there was one black.
Was one. Whether it's the same person or not, it's easy to check. We just
Yeah.
go back and find that other biography.
That would be
So,
great.
My real question is, what did you see in the readership of books like Uncle Tom's Cabin or anything else of that line in those years? Who was reading that, since in those years you could still see who was checking out the books?
Yeah, I was looking for that book. Haven't seen it in the catalog. I haven't seen Harriet Beecher Stowe. I was looking for like any kind of anti-slavery anything. By that time, that was a pretty, even for anti-slavery, it was a pretty middle of the road book. But, you know, that's us kind of looking back too. I mean, still at the time, and New York, remember, is a center of pro-slavery political thought. And so, but I did not see that book there. I was looking for any possible. The only one I saw was Lydia Maria Child, but I was there for a week, so
Somewhere in the library would be the record when it first got the book, which it eventually did.
And we have asked this question, I've asked this question too, because so not all of the books, even if they're now in the library, they were not necessarily bought at the time. Like I think I asked this about the Frederick Douglass narrative.
Yes,
I'm pointing to Barbara for those who are
So
watching.
the records that we have, we don't have too many immediate acquisition records available for a lot of our books. What we do have are sort of the printed catalog of books that have happened, and they come periodically throughout our history. So when we were looking for Leslie, it was pre-Civil War, so the last book that we had printed was 1850 for our catalog, and Harriet Beecher Stowe did not show up in the 1850, it didn't show up in the previous one. So it did come into the library, it just came in after
We
the
think
period, I think after the period
That
we
makes
were looking for
Right.
Leslie's research.
Thanks, that's a great question though. It's, you know, hard to figure that out. Yes.
I'm curious.
Oh wait, I think you're about to get a.
You don't mind.
Oh, different. I'm curious to know, wealthy blacks, Jeremiah,
Hamilton, yes.
where did they live? Where did they build their houses? I imagine they're beautiful houses.
Some, yeah, and some in Lower Manhattan. So there isn't residential segregation in the way that we think, and certainly not in the way we often think of it in the South. And so they would have built where they were able to. There's a lot more racial mixture. I have to say, when I was working on my book, I wasn't looking so much at the wealthier Black people and where they were located. I was more concerned about working class people, but they are in the same Lower Manhattan neighborhoods. They're not in the sort of completely elite neighborhoods. And there are some places where African Americans clustered. particularly after emancipation, they move away from where their enslavers are, who are mostly on the east side, lower east side, and they move closer to, they're more on the west side. I think even in Greenwich Village, maybe when I'll get to some more of this service book a little later, but they're mixed in. Yeah, so it's not like there's a black neighborhood, it's not like a Harlem black neighborhood kind of situation. The other place I'd point you to, of course, is the Seneca Village, which was destroyed to make way for Central Park, and it was characterized as a place of impoverishment and all kinds of things. But that was where some of the first in the Emancipation era, some of the first African Americans who owned land. And so those landowners were there. There were churches there as well, and schools and things too.
Question? So I might throw in a question that came to my mind in listening to you tonight. This is a little bit wearing your hat as having done this research, and a little bit wearing your hat as a professor at Northwestern. I feel that maybe not here because we're lucky, but in many book-oriented places today, people are being asked to justify, like, why do books matter? And a lot of what's said is they inspire compassion. Did you read about people who aren't like yourself, and it tells you that there's different ways of being human, and that that's a positive thing. Looking at that idea with those two hats on, what do you see in the reading patterns of our members? Were they ever looking to get outside their own experience? Maybe they were, to some extent, because they were reading travel narratives and everything. And what do you just think of that idea today at all?
Yeah, it's a very hopeful idea. And I say that as someone, I mean, I grew up in libraries, so, you know, I love the title of this exhibition. There are so many things that reading constantly, as you know, throughout my life has exposed me to that I wouldn't know any other way. At the same time, we're definitely in a moment where, and maybe have always been in a moment where if you look back, what people choose to read can sometimes very easily reinforce what they already know. Not everyone is reading to go in a new direction. I certainly was. Many people are. We can think about this also in terms of higher education. You know, there are studies of what people know who have obtained college degrees, and yet we also know that some of our more, I would say, conservative, or, you know, even people who are now, we're in this moment where people are not trusting science, not trusting research. Some of those people are people who went to college and hold degrees. And so even the exposure to you know, in many institutions of higher education, it's about the substance of what you learn, but it's also how you learn, how we know what we know. And yet we're in this moment when there's a lot of challenge to that. So, you know, critical thinking is our watchword often, critical reading. But, you know, thinking about, I guess, in terms of institutions, there's always that question of, you know, when I was thinking about this library, you know, what did they demark as intellectual? What did they demark as important? And I think that was the disappointment, is that here, these people over here having this incredible conversation. There are other ways to get to it, certainly. But for whatever reason, the library felt that it was not, that was not part of its charge. I would have to know more about other libraries and how they were thinking. You know, maybe they had a vision of themselves as part of a larger ecology with some libraries do this, we do this, I don't know. But yeah, it's complicated. I mean, and we have a similar, I think, question with higher education institutions. How do we, as one institution, hold different ideas about the future of any number of issues facing us? But also, when do we say, nah, those issues are not the ones we're going to support? We're not even going to support exploration. So I'll step back into, I guess now maybe almost 20 years ago, the controversy with Charles Murray and the bell curve. And many people saying, this is not legitimate science anymore. This is not how we understand how intelligence works. And yet that he's still on the lecture circuit. I mean, it still comes up. And so how do we decide that we have come to a conclusion about this? I mean, you could think of the same thing with these people. When did they decide that the pro-slavery arguments were not the right arguments, you know? And we might have them in our library as an example, but not as, something that's an exemplar of moving forward. It's knowledge, but it's about how we don't want to go in that direction. So it's those kinds of questions. How do we decide what's the right way to go?
First of all, I would like to congratulate you for an incredibly good talk.
Thank you.
Many ways amazing, because you also contextualize it in American history. For someone who's a historian, myself, and a colleague from our university,
Thank you.
but not Americans, I learned a lot.
Thank you.
And I also would like to congratulate Sarah and everybody who had, Ms. Halliday, and everybody who had to do with this program events, this particular lecture, and the late Ms. Spira. Congratulations, because it's incredibly good in order to kind of understand where the library stands and all its wealth, as it were, not literally, we learned about that well. Now, even that. And the final one, maybe a very not personal one, but one that didn't interest me. What did you find in the papers of Nathan, Jeremiah Hamilton?
In his papers about
Yeah.
I did, yeah, so that's not my research, that's really Shane's, and I guess what are you thinking about him?
Well, because I'm an economic historian, I would like to know what millionaires were making at the time.
Oh.
And, but, well, I'll bother.
Yes, and Shane White's book is right there, so
Yeah.
flip right back to that index, I'm sure it's in there. Right,
Thank
but he,
you.
according to Shane, and he built this amazing palace of a home that everyone was commenting on, and I'm not sure what neighborhood it was in, I didn't hold that piece in my brain, but it's in that book, and Shane's very good at that, so he will have all the details for that, yeah, thank you.
Well, maybe in moving toward a conclusion, if you don't mind my asking, what are you researching now in work one?
Well, as it turns out, I'm originally from New Orleans. I'm working on a book called Leaving New Orleans: A Personal Urban History. I'm hoping to finish it this year, finally. It's a book that uses my family's history experience and Hurricane Katrina as a way to talk about the future, the past and future of the city. So, yeah, it's taken quite a bit of time to wrestle it to the ground and quiet voices in my head about it. But it's been very interesting to work on. So a book about another city that I love.
Excellent. Well, we will look forward to reading that in due course. So thank you so much, Dr. Harris. This has been fantastic.